Hello and welcome to the third episode of Filtered the Podcast. My name is Phil Dye. I'm based in Thirroul, near Sydney, near Wollongong in Australia. And this episode is on the disease of diversity. We've been hearing about diversity for about the last 10 years and how wonderful it is. And initially, yes, it all sounded very, very fine. But over the last couple of years, the word has been hijacked. And it's been hijacked by extremists who take it to such a level that it creates an inequity. It creates a degree of unfairness. Forrest Gump, when he said stupid is as stupid does, he was saying that while people aren't essentially stupid, they should be judged by their actions, not by their identity. But in our current craze of diversity, we tend to be judging people by their identity, by who they are and who they identify as. This means that a job seeker can be advantaged by who they are and who they identify as, not by what they've done and on the merit they may have. We give them an advantage, and that is simply not fair. So, for this episode, I interview Colleen Harkin. Colleen is the National Manager of Class Action Programs for the Institute of Public Affairs. She's also a research fellow at the Institute and is a very clear thinker and a straight talker. Now, it is true that on the diversity issue, many people are unwilling to speak out and say their mind. If they disagree with diversity, they can be called a homophobe, a transphobe, a racist, all sorts of names. And it's not true. They're simply saying that this isn't fair. It's nothing against the individuals. But Colleen is a straight talker, and I first asked her about her history and her role at the Institute of Public Affairs.
So I've got a bit of an eclectic background, really. My initial training was in education. I have a master's degree, and I worked in classrooms, and I was an education consultant. And I moved out of that into IT, had my own small business, excuse me, and I've been a political staffer. I've had my own business. I've sort of had this sort of eclectic scenario, but ironically where I've ended up now is in a role that, sort of puts all of those pieces of a jigsaw together.
Colleen, the word diversity has a wonderful feel-good sort of ring to it, but what does diversity really mean in modern society?
Yeah, it does have a lovely ring to it, doesn't it? But diversity today sort of talks about the difference in your characteristics, such as, race, gender, your ethnicity, and it's a divisive concept rather than a unifying one. It diminishes a person's individuality. We're all individuals. We've got our own opinions based on who we are and what our backgrounds have been, and not what we look like. So, diversity is important, but it needs to be diversity of opinion and life experience and, not diversity of race and gender.
So to paraphrase Forrest Gump, it would be what we do and our deeds rather than what we look like.
Well, it's more about who you are as it should be more about who you are as an individual, not sort of this kind of surface level box that you can put somebody into. And ironically, diversity often means, stereotyping people and putting them into a box rather than actually allowing the diversity of the individual to flourish.
Yeah. So if an employer has a diversity recruiting practice, what does this mean for those people who are applying for positions?
Well, typically a diversity recruiting practice would mean that they want to hire people of a specified or certain background. And again, it's divisive. It undermines equality of opportunity. and the idea of, meritocracy, the idea of you are employed on your ability, and to give everybody a fair go. We all want those people who are less fortunate to get a leg up, but diversity hiring actually means that they're hiring based on subjective characteristics of a person rather than a person's capacity to actually, make a contribution and do the task required.
So the idea of merit has gone.
Yes, definitely. In this scenario where, the priority of hiring is a subjective characteristic, merit actually gets, pushed further back down the line.
Okay, so how can a candidate get over this? I mean, do they fudge their diversity credentials? Is that what's starting to happen?
Well, I can't speak to what people might be doing to overcome some of those prejudices, but it is definitely an issue that if an organisation is recruiting with specific subjective characteristics as their high priority, and you don't possess those, but you happen to be a candidate who is the most capable, I'm not quite sure how you're actually going to get through that brick wall that's there first, but because we are losing, and in some situations perhaps have lost the priority of merit.
In the New South Wales Department of Education, the person who wrote the behaviour policy for the inclusive engaging education doctrine had never ever been in front of a classroom. So I would imagine diversity employment was a part of that person's engagement. Would that be right?
Well, I can't speak to any particular individual, but definitely there are a lot of complaints around, particularly within the education department, that those who are writing the policies have never been inside a classroom. They don't know anything about delivering a curriculum. They've never managed a classroom. Some of the policies, there's a recent report that's come out just last week about the level of disruption and violence in classrooms. It was a report released in New South Wales, and how often you're allowed to suspend a student. I think it was 3 times a year or something. I mean, these are sort of just, random benchmarks without knowing any of the detail of what it's actually like to manage a classroom of 25 kids. And if you've got a couple of kids in there who are persistently unruly, you've got bureaucrats putting copious amounts of documentation together who really have no real life experience of the role itself.
Yeah. The statistics, 49% of all principals have been physically abused.
There's some horrific stats that are coming out about the level of violence and disruption, and the OECD results have shown that Australian schools are some of the most disruptive in the OECD world. So we came in 70th out of 77 countries for classroom cultural environment and disruption. So, we've got a pretty serious problem that needs to be addressed.
Most certainly. I mean, when Turkey and Brazil and Argentina are well above us as far as classroom safety goes, we've got a real problem.
Well, there wouldn't be many work environments where an employee would be exposed to those work conditions. So we have to back the teachers and give them the tools and the framework to do something about this. You can't have a situation where half of your workforce is being physically or verbally abused. It wouldn't be tolerated in any other workplace.
No, exactly right. It's an occupational health and safety issue. And you think that there would be some legal comeback.
Well, unfortunately, I think the result is that a lot of teachers are, raising their hands and saying, I just don't want to do it anymore. Our education system is in an absolute crisis situation. Teachers are overrun with paperwork and compliance, overrun with dealing with, disruptive students and documentation, complaining parents. Very little of their time is sort of devoted to the actual task of teaching and being allowed to actually teach. So, way too many of our teachers are just saying this is just not what I want to be doing anymore.
Yeah. Now, if we bring that back and we say, well, okay, the policies are made in government departments, and we used education there by individuals who have no skin in the game, that they haven't got any experience, but they're employed on perhaps a diversity, that they fit a certain other criteria other than merit. What do you say to those who preach that the staff, employees of an organisation, whether it be a company or a government department, should reflect either the customers or the people that they actually serve? For example, if you've got 2% of Indians in your population in the council, you should employ 2% of Indians. What do you say to that?
Well, it's another example of, diversity that actually divides us. I don't know how you could ever have a situation where you can formulate that any organisation is a percentage-wise reflection of the community, and where do you stop? It's actually a measure for excluding some people and dividing the community rather than equal opportunity. It ought not to be a scenario where we are forcing equal outcomes, and that's part of the challenge with this stuff, is that we all want to give those people who need a leg up some assistance, but that doesn't mean that we exclude people of merit. The whole issue of meritocracy. So diversity has the great danger consistently of excluding people and demanding an equal outcome rather than equal opportunity. So when what you've identified is the logical end point of the diversity doctrine, that we're all concepts of an individual person are ignored in favour of a group box that a person happens to fit within.
Yes. And I'm told by my gay friends that they have never, ever felt excluded on the basis of their sexual orientation. And look, as a matter of fact, some have said that being gay is a foot in the door in some companies or government departments. Isn't this the exact opposite of diversity?
Well, I can't speak to the experience of, to those sorts of experiences, but what you've suggested points to the bigger challenge, is that as a society, we risk judging people solely on very superficial characteristics rather than their innate qualities as a human being. So people need to be seen through the prism, sort of seeing people through the prism of their boxed identity is dehumanising. People are sort of complex and multifaceted, and we shouldn't be reducing them to a label that sits above their head, whether they're, gay, trans, religious, female, whatever label you want to put on people. That's just that is dehumanising people.
But according to some people I've spoken to, that their identity gives them a foot in the door when it comes to employment.
Well, to your earlier point about organisations having diversity recruiting practices, that may well be the case. That that there may be priority given to certain diverse labels, but the ultimate problem with that is that we are dehumanising people. We're sort of putting labels on people, and the idea of recruiting to a label ultimately means that you're not really being diverse at all. You're demanding a particular outcome rather than giving equal opportunity. So it's not an equal opportunity. It's not an equal playing field. You're sort of handpicking a few labels that you want, and in doing so, you are definitionally excluding the real opportunity for diversity.
The Filtered podcast can be heard on most streaming services or the Substack platform. It only costs $30 per year Australian to subscribe to both the podcast and the magazine. That's just $20 US. To subscribe, just search for Filtered on Substack.
It comes down to that we're a TikTok generation, TikTok world, whereas what you see in 6 seconds is who you are, and that's not the case, of course.
Well, I don't know about you, but everyone I know are pretty complex people. So,
indeed,
we are not just one label. We are not just. I'm not just a female. I'm a mum. I'm a professional. I play sport. Everybody has layers of facets to who they are, and to just give a person one characteristic and to say that we are going to employ and demand outcomes and stuff according to one label is very problematic.
Yes, I would agree with you. And coming back to merit, and you've got to have the best person for the job. But it seems that our government departments and many businesses are now, their recruitment is controlled by people with a diversity focus, that they have certain qualities that they want. Now, what can be done about that? Because this means that there's certain people who are dominating. Now, I'll give you an example, Colleen. The BBC in England have recently dumped their diversity policies because the LGBTIQ community was being employed at a greater rate than people who weren't in that community. And so they've dumped all liaison with them. They've dumped their partnership with Stonewall because the public that they were serving was seeing that this was really out of balance. So how is it time for Australian companies to do something similar?
I do think that most of these issues come out of an original good intention. I don't think there are very, very many people who set out to, deconstruct everything that we're doing and reconstruct it in a way that's objectionable. So, let me sort of just put that comment in and then set it aside.
Yeah.
That in most of these situations, we've lost focus about what the point of all of this is. And the only way that we can change things is as a community, as people, is to speak, is to be heard and to say, this is not actually what we want. Now, there are organisations where it's an easy way to do that. You stop shopping at a place, you write them a letter, you write to your MP, you talk to your friends. I mean, we do still live in a democracy where, we do have a voice and we can use our voice to great change and to, great impact. So the idea that, we sort of sit back and take it, that's not the case. We can actually speak up and do something about these things. So it doesn't change overnight. None of these things have come in overnight. But, but we can actually be sort of a bit activist in our view about them.
Yeah. Okay, I'll make a point of agreeing with you that the entire idea of inclusion and diversity and all of that was basically great, but it seems the radicals, the extremists, have taken over those words and made them into something different. But yes, I agree that basically it was all good intentioned. But you said to be an activist and to get our voice heard, but mainstream media doesn't seem to want to listen to anything that differs.
Well, unfortunately, I think our media class, there isn't the depth of journalism that there has been in the past. We've sort of turned into a society that's interested in clickbait and 6-second reads. So it's a lot of sensationalism and alarmism and all of those isms, that are constantly around us. And so there isn't necessarily a great level of conversation about some of these things. And the media class are driven by, getting click-throughs. So that is very much part of the problem.
Even the ABC seems driven by that lately.
Well, the ABC seems to have a very particular perspective of the world, shamelessly some of the times. Their perspective of how they present information, and like, for example, the stuff, in Alice Springs, and their reporting of some incidences is particularly biased.
I rang the ABC, this would be about a year and a half ago. They were talking about domestic violence and child abuse in Australia, and I rang and said, look, we have to divide it up between some of the rural outback communities, because that's where the problems really are the greatest, and we should have programs in those communities. And the producer said that was being racist, and I couldn't separate Australians.
Yep.
I thought, well, how on earth are we going to fix this problem if we can't target separate communities with separate programs? It's completely ridiculous.
Well, the trouble is that words like racist have taken on a whole different perspective of their own. Just to mention skin colour, for example, is now considered racist. And it isn't. I mean, there's an attitude an underlying attitude of something can, of course, be racist, but just to segregate or to identify a problem, in a particular area where most people have, for example, blonde hair and blue eyes, is not racist. It's an analysis of data.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to be, literally more mature and sophisticated in our approach of actually being able to analyse and discuss solutions for these things. Otherwise, it becomes a blanket comment about, an entire country that is, and so you miss the opportunity to help find solutions.
It's very anti-fact. It's completely dismissing truth that sexual violence against children in outback rural communities is worse. Now, if they're not going to agree to that or admit that is correct data, well, there's something very wrong.
And this is part of the challenge with there's a whole sort of what I call the woke cloak that goes over a lot of businesses, education, media, that we talk about feelings rather than facts, and feelings trump facts. So whether I've hurt someone's feelings by, making a comment or making an observation about a particular geographic area or whatever, I might hurt someone's feelings. But without actually being able to talk about the facts and recognise that they're facts, we actually get nowhere. So, and that problem exists, like I said, it's what I call the woke cloak. It goes over everything. And analysing facts has become a secondary or even third tier issue that is pushed down the line, well behind sentimentality and feelings, which is it just means that ultimately we are not addressing problems properly.
And this gets back to diversity, where perhaps people are being employed on feelings, not on the actual facts of what they have done historically.
Yeah, and so you have a situation where, of course it would be nice to have, this scenario where we can say, well, we have representation of all these different types of people in our society. But it actually doesn't mean that you actually have people with the required skill set. And that you're giving the leg up to people who really need it. For example, you end up in this formulated scenario of people with labels on the top of their head, and you're just ticking boxes.
The Filtered podcast and magazine are fully funded by subscriptions and donations. For $30 a year or $5 per month, you get all written pieces and podcasts from the Filtered Substack. Just click on the subscribe or donate boxes to keep reading or listening to the difficult, yet important views about society on the brink.
And for listeners in other parts of the world, or this is coming from Australia, but this woke cloak disease that you talk about is worldwide in Western society, isn't it?
It's all over the place. I'm pleased to say that there is pushback that we're starting to see, particularly in the UK and in America, and particularly in the school systems as well. So I think part of the challenge is that those of us who are, if I can use the word conservative, middle of the road people, generally people who are accepting of other people's lives, and you live your life and I'll live mine, and that's okay. But there's a recognition that some of those individual rights have been overridden, and that the hard left view of the world is not allowing actually diversity of thought. So kids at school are taught what to think, not how to think. And there's a lot of sort of pushback to say, whoa, this has all gone too far. It's one thing to sort of accept change in community and be mindful that I live my life and you live yours, and that we might have very different views of the world and very different values, but there are some core principles that we have to agree that I have a right to my child being taught how to think, not what to think. And there is very much a pushback across the world that is a movement that's starting to say, I don't want the state, I don't want the government telling my child all of that stuff. And I don't want to be in a situation where the media is feeding me stuff without actually giving me the other side of the story to consider and make up my own mind. And I'll give you just a small example, if I could, with the Voice to Parliament legislation coming up. The school system, the government is distributing, and the unions, only the yes side of the vote. Everybody needs to be able to consider both sides and make up their own mind. And so there is this pushback to say, people need to be able to make their own choices, and in order to be able to make a choice, you need to be informed and have all parts of any particular argument.
Look, it most certainly, but the government is supposed to be funding both sides equally. I'm not sure whether that's being done.
Look, I know initially they weren't going to fund anything, but there was a commitment to fund both sides. But what I've heard is that the teachers' union they have made a statement that they're supporting the yes. Now, even in that, I mean, the union doesn't and ought not to be able to speak for every single teacher. That should not be a situation where they can tell the world how me as a teacher thinks.
No, that's exactly right. But individuals, some, I believe, are scared to actually say what they actually think because, as you mentioned before, you'll be labelled a racist, and you actually, it's actually dividing society, and I'm very concerned about what the outcome could be.
It's a very common thing that I hear, particularly in the role that I have here at the IPA. I get loads of emails from parents and grandparents saying, thank you, so glad that somebody's bringing, shining a light on some of these issues, because I can't do it. I can't say that out loud. So we have a situation in community where people are genuinely concerned and too afraid to say what they think for fear of being labelled, particularly a racist or a bigot or a homophobe or any kind of phobe that you want. And it just shuts down the conversation. It's a very easy way to stop people from speaking.
Yeah. A friend of mine is a school principal, and he's discussed it in this gender dysphoria stuff that's happening with kids in schools. But he said that if a child is wanting to identify as a different sex, and the parents say no, they're not going to support that, then the principal has to report them to child justice. Now, that's pretty incredible stuff.
There's there's legislation called mature minor, and that's where this parameters come into play. That the school can decide that on a particular issue, that they can decide that the child is mature enough to make their own decisions, and if they deem that, the school has the legal authority to continue down a particular path concerning that child that the parents may disagree with. It's very significant legislation that all parents should understand and be very aware of, the potential ramifications of that.
Yeah.
So yes, if you're in a situation where you don't agree with a pathway that your child might want to be taking, and your child is, say, 14 years old, the school does have the legal right to determine that child a mature minor and cut you out of the process. And in doing so, if you become a problem in being cut out of that process, as most parents would be very concerned about, they then have that process that legally open to them of reporting you to authorities, and there's a whole consequence pathway after that.
As if that 14-year-old actually knows what they want to do for the rest of their life, and it's like any adolescent, we're all confused, and perhaps parents have just got to say no.
Well, yeah, and the average teenager, I think. Without being unkind to teenagers, I always think of them as their job is to push the boundaries. It's part of the process of growing up, is to push boundaries, and hopefully there are walls around to stop you going too far, because they're sort of like the safekeeping of teenagers. But it is their job to push around and work out who they are as a person and how they operate and what they think, and some of that can be really challenging stuff. But, the idea of supporting them and allowing them to do whatever they want to do are two different things.
Yeah. Yes, it's the role of the parent then to establish firm but fair boundaries and ensure that the child understands those. Because society is full of boundaries. We have laws.
Well, that's right. And also to enable a teenager to go through any process that doesn't necessarily have any long-term significant residual damage, and I don't mean in terms of any ideological or agenda. I mean even in terms of, going out, mucking up with their friends, any mistake. I mean, teenagers make mistakes. I mean, adults make mistakes too, but it's a very tricky time of their life, and most people would look back on their teenage years and go, I was lucky. I made lots of mistakes during that time, and if social media had been around when I was a teenager, how many adults have stories where they say, "Gee, I'm glad there wasn't a camera all during all of my teenage years," that sort of thing. So, but that's a parent's job, and it's in my view, it's not the government's job. That's the difference, and it comes back to...
Yeah, it's the parent's job.
Correct. And it comes back to who is actually responsible, who has the right to look after their own child, and who has the responsibility.
It's not the education department's job. Now, look, finally, Colleen, when we vote for a politician or a party, they never, as far as I heard, the last couple of elections, they never reveal their position on diversity, gender identity, and everything that we've been discussing. Are we being actually lied to by omission? Are they just not talking about those important things which parents want to know about? And should politicians and parties make the stance on these things clear?
It's an interesting question. There are certainly some politicians who make their personal views on a whole lot of ideology known and well known. But I'd actually go an extra step and say that the government has no place in our personal lives. So I would take the extra step and say, I don't want government to be involved. I want the small government and to be out of our lives as much as possible. So I don't mind what a person thinks and what kind of life they want to live. We're all entitled to live our best life within the boundaries of the law. Now, I know, the obvious question is that is being, well, who makes the law and what's the law about? But there is that fundamental scenario that says if we could get government out of our lives and stop giving them more and more and more power, that's sort of my preference, to go the opposite way and say, I don't want schools to have the right to, over my child. My child is my responsibility. Stop giving other people currency over our own lives.
Yes, I'm sure the people in New South Wales a couple of weeks ago did not vote for gender-affirming treatment of children as young as 9, yet that is what's happening with puberty blockers and hormones. And of course, we never hear about that. That was never mentioned by the winning party in the election.
Well, and that's where, again, it's a case of having these conversations out in the open, and the pushback that is happening overseas, where again, if we stay silent, there is no change. Silence is compliance, really.
Silence is consent. I used to teach that very thing at university.
Yeah. So, it doesn't matter what the issue is. If somebody has, if there's something that you feel passionately about, the obligation is on the individual to speak up and to try and do something about it. And again, that comes back to, we're not labels. We're individual people who have rights and responsibilities. And the big thing is the responsibility. Individual rights comes with responsibility.
And that was Colleen Harkin from the Institute of Public Affairs. She's the National Manager for Class Action Programs and Research Fellow at the Institute, and you can find them on ipa.org.au. ipa.org.au. Now, I did mention in that interview that I used to teach consent theory at university, and one of those theories involved was the spiral of silence. The spiral of silence theory was proposed by a German political scientist, Elisabeth Noel Neumann, and it said that when people didn't speak up, they didn't speak up because they thought that everyone else would disagree with them. It funnels down so that people are more and more silent, and when they're more and more silent, it's likely to bubble up as some sort of volcano of dissatisfaction. So nowadays, I think people are falling into that spiral of silence, and they're not speaking up. Now, what could you do if you're facing a diversity platform in your workplace that is really now become discriminatory? Because diversity employment on its own, without merit, is basically discriminatory. So what could you do? You could build a recruitment oversight committee, or ask that one be formed. You could say no to mandatory diversity training in the workplace, because that sort of training has now become rife in government departments and big corporations. And you could also try and introduce a policy that says you can't discriminate in favour of gender, race, identity, age, etc. when it comes to employment, because diversity really, as I mentioned, without merit is discriminatory. And those who follow an extreme ideology hate to be called discriminatory or to be called out on discriminatory practice. My name's Phil Dye. You've been listening to Filtered the Podcast. Please remember that you can subscribe to the magazine and the podcast through Substack. Just go to Substack and search for Filtered, Philtered. I'll see you again soon.